All right, welcome back again, John. Got our frequent flyer. So today I made sure that I had tea that you taught
Right.
me how to make last time, and
Cheers.
I brought also I can't actually gift them with you, but I have digestives, McVitie's particular, and then I brought some because I can't get fudge today. I
Oh,
brought some good old American black bottom pie.
marvelous. Yeah,
Yeah,
don't forget to dunk your digestives in your tea.
I know. It's
But be careful so they don't break and end up as slosh at the bottom.
I know they quickly turn into wet sand if you're not
Exactly,
careful.
exactly. But just a nice comforting taste. And
Yeah,
chocolate digestives are just the extra edge if you go for those. Just
the
beautiful.
best, the
That was my
best.
breakfast this morning. A couple of chocolate digestives and tea. So
Excellent, excellent. That's how I like to start my morning, or pack tea with me if I go somewhere. It's like a token snack, kind of. So
hmm.
we were just talking about source material a second ago. What would
Mhm.
be? I'm curious. Do you have, or like, what's the oldest written source material that you've been able to find as far as sources go? Because you do phylogenetics and you look at having
Mhm.
AI document or translate sources for you. So, what's the oldest source you've been able to find so far?
So the oldest written source or material we have is the the Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia. That's the oldest written material we have today. Um, but in terms of other cultures, it does vary. So, for example, and it causes issues in sort of research. So, for example, I talk a lot about the Nordic myths, and we have the Eddas there, the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, but they're really secondary sources. So even though the Poetic Edda is meant to be the poems told by people at the time, because they're written a couple of hundred years after the event, and they're written by someone who isn't of that culture, they're Christian rather than have traditional religious background. We find that those poems may well be what we call corrupted, is a term we use. And we find that all over. So we have records of Native American, so First Nation, North American tribes. They were taken down in the 1800s. And we have to assume that, this again, whilst it seems like their primary source, we just don't know for sure. And also because you get these notes written down so late in the day, so let's say the 19th century, how do you know the myths we're writing down for those North American tribes are, let's say, 10,000 years old or 1,000 years old? You just don't know. And it's even worse when you go to Africa because nothing's been written down again till in the last 1,000 years, and often in the last 500 years. So even though people want to say, oh, the oldest myths in the world are from Africa or even Australia, there's just no written evidence to suggest that. What you have to do is rely on iconography, so let's say cave paintings and the like, to maybe give us clues. And we do that for the dragon myth. So the dragon myth, we see cave paintings in South Africa that could relate to that myth. So they depict animals within a river, and the original dragon was a water serpent of sorts, or a water animal. So yeah, it is really tough, and you really have to be aware of that. So yeah, and it's critical. And the reason it's critical is that when you do phylogenetics, which is the methodology or the scientific process we use to understand the source of a myth or its age, we really want to rely on the specific language used in the myth, the specific words being spoken. Because if we see a myth being told across a landscape, and we can see the words changing subtly across that landscape, and that change aligns with known migration paths, which are proven through DNA or archaeology and the like, we can actually see if the language changed in accordance to that narrative into those words. And if it did, then we can have great confidence that the myth being told from one source is exactly the same as the other source and is written correctly. rather than has been misinterpreted by the person taking the notes of that source.
All right, interesting. Okay, because I would have always pictured that there could have been like a connection between cave paintings that somehow connect with a written source somewhere.
And
Uh,
that's interesting. So, as you think of cave paintings, they tend to range from about 10,000 years ago to 30,000 years ago. And yet, the oldest writing we've got is maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years old, at best, maybe nearer 4,000 years for when writing really took off. So, there's a huge gap, at least 5,000 years
mhm.
between cave painting narrative and writing. And we do see iconography in terms of sculptures and carvings that start coming in. And don't forget, we've also lost a lot where much material was carved on wood before sort of 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, and that being organic, that disappears. So we don't often have records of the carvings and that made in wood. We're reliant on stone and bone. So yeah, that's it's very hard then to then draw a connection when you've got this 5,000 year gap in the more recent history to say, actually, does the painting align to a story? But you do see some figures. We certainly see it in the Nordic myths, we see figures of what could be a thunder god. We see certainly figures doing ritual behavior with cows, which is interesting because Indo-European had cows as a core animal, primordial being in their myths. And so to see early representations of ritual behavior with cattle in Scandinavia is very interesting, but they're few and far between.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, how old are some of these figures that we're finding with cows?
The cow figures, I think they're probably at least 3,000 to maybe 4,000 years old, and that ties in well with Indo-European migrations. And their iconography, so they're almost like stick figures. And we actually have a picture of a man procreating with a cow.
Nice.
As one of those, well, I say it's some ritualistic behaviour, but you see that in India with the horse. So there's a horse sacrifice in India,
Yeah.
which lasts a year, a really intricate.
They also have a temple. They also have a temple called Khajuraho where they've carved depictions of men procreating with a variety of animals.
So we see this. We see some ritual behaviour, some procreation take place, and then a sacrifice often happen, and it could be that is a part of that and relates to an older part of mythology we have now lost.
Mm-hmm.
So because there aren't many. Well, I don't have any stories we can authenticate that relate to procreation with cattle in Indo-European mythology. I'm happy to be corrected on that, but certainly I can't recall any off the top of my head.
Okay, all right. That is interesting. Though I had not known about any sort of cow or cattle figures in particular.
Yes. So that's interesting because one of the things I teach is creation myths. That's my sort of specialist subject, certainly in the European mythology. And the cow is a big feature in that. And so the myth I tell is one that has been recreated by the likes of Bruce Lincoln, who was a student of Eliade, who's a pretty famous mythologist. Bruce Lincoln was more of a religious historian. And David Anthony, if you may be familiar with David Anthony, he wrote the book, The Horse, the Wheel, Language. He, again, used that in that book. I think it's in chapter 8 if you're interested, where he recreates the creation myth of the Indo-Europeans. And that myth seems to be very Indo-European centric, or so he says. But if you actually look at some of the mythology, it doesn't seem to be 100% pastoral based. So the Indo-Europeans were pastoral farmers. And so rather than grow crops they bred animals because it gave them more food and it gave them more mobility. And that was one of the reasons why they spread and dispersed so well over the continents. And so the view is that their early myth must be related to the myths in Scandinavia, for example, because there's a cattle in it, it must be Indo-European. But we actually see aspects of the myth that don't really seem Indo-European. So we have to ask, are they hunter-gatherer? Which is unlikely, because hunter-gatherers probably weren't necessarily farming cattle like that. They may be aware of herds of animals, but certainly not cattle. But they did have goats, I believe. They're quite popular. Or were they early European farmers? So people from the Near East, from Mesopotamia, they eventually came into Europe around 8,000 years ago. And so went into Scandinavia. And we know that for sure because there are early European farming myths, like agricultural farming myths, well within the Viking mythology, such as Baldur's Dramur, Baldur's Dream, which is a trip to the underworld, which is, you see, in many times in the Near East. So because you see this, and you see a Thumbler, who's a cow in Nordic mythology, doing things like not only creating the first god by licking ice, but also from the others Emir drinks, which is why we think it may be an early form of pastoral farming myth rather than solid pastoral farming. But before that, we see Emir's milk actually being used to create rivers that create wells of that where realms start. And that again seems very agricultural rather than pastoral. So it's interesting to sort of try and link all this together to find out what came first. And that is actually one of the things I'm researching at the moment. And I hope to have a paper out probably next year that will sort of research that further and in effect go over Lincoln's work and try and recreate a better version of the creation myth and extract from it the pieces that seem to be Near Eastern motifs, because that may give us a better understanding of how the early European farmers and the early steppe people integrated.
Fascinating. Interesting. That's very interesting to think about. Okay. So do we have also figures from the Indo-European area that might even predate that 4,000 years that help give, or any objects aside from archaeological finds that might?
We do see some figurines. Cultures are sort of out of my scope of specialism, but certainly in the region of sort of Bulgaria, Romania, I want to say it's the Dinka tribe, but I may be wrong. But there are certainly figurines there that probably start appearing when the early European farmers turn up, or when the Near Eastern farmers come into Europe. That sort of region. So they cross from Anatolia or Turkey into Greece and move up, and there's the Danube there, and obviously that's a main route they use to migrate into Europe. And we start seeing around that region these figurines pop up. So we do see those, but there are sitting figures. Many of them may well be male rather than female, which suggests more Indo-European influence, but it may also suggest hunter-gatherer influence or certainly pre-agricultural farming influence. But that's and there's a few there, but as I say, much was carved in wood, and so we don't really see too much there. Certainly not of religious artifacts or facts we could items we could consider that. So it is a bit of a blank from around. Well, it is just a bit of a blank, really.
Yeah. So yes. we're looking at pre stonework, pre clay, pre stonework.
Mm.
Yeah, interesting. It's very interesting. That is kind of, though, like a interesting thing that comes to mind is like, all right, they had wood, they were able to work with wood, and
easily, yep.
Like thousands of years before stonework was probably even on the radar. And it's just
yes,
a giant gap.
Yeah, well, we see certain stones carved, we certainly see bone carved. I mean, we see that from about, say, 30,000, or well, the earliest carving we've got is around 40,000 years with the Lion Man of Lomench, which is quite a famous figure. The Lion Man is quite a tall thing. People say it's like a man in a lion suit, but But that's the first real carving we have, like humanoid carving. And then after that, we see the Venus figures, what they're called. So all these women with exaggerated female parts,
Yeah.
which may well have been. I don't think they are religious figures per se. I think they're probably more aligned to, want a better word to call it.
Yeah.
For a number of reasons, but basically, men are men, and if you can, much like today, we have access to material really easily, but it is used by men all the time, not by women, or predominantly men. The same must apply through human history. That men like visual stimulation. So seriously, so
that's the great mystery of it.
It's a great mystery.
It's not religious.
Well, that makes the world go round. So, and that sort of makes sense because we don't see that female figure goddess everywhere. It's only in particular places. So it isn't like it's a belief, and beliefs were reasonably common 30,000 years ago because we see stories that exist across Eurasia and into North America that migrate there,
right.
But they don't have the Venus
particular areas where we find the Venus figurines.
Predominantly Europe, sort of Central Western Europe. So around the Alps, so where Germany, southern Germany, France, towards Spain. That's where many of them sort of crop up at the same sort of time frame near similar valleys, and then as time goes on, sort of to 20,000 years, that you see more and more figures going into Central and then touching on Eastern Europe and places like that. So
okay,
but there are elsewhere, but that's where the majority of them seem to be found.
Okay, so do we see that the figures change too in the regions?
They are, so before farming comes along, the figures do seem to have a consistent exaggeration of female body parts associated with them. And we actually see that in cave paintings. There's a very interesting cave painting which looks like a lion or a bull. And if we actually look at it, and this is in France, I believe, it is actually started life as a vulva. Mm-hmm. So it's like a V shape, and then someone's changed it into a cattle and another animal.
Interesting.
So we see that.
Yeah, that would make sense. I can't remember where in the Middle East is from. Middle East, Northeast Africa area, but there's a famous stone carving. It used to be in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, but it was a picture of a bull and a lion fighting, and the explanation for it, or like the whole point of it was a description of love. Bull and lion fighting. Okay, so what is our earliest written creation myth?
Okay, so that must be really the Enuma Elish, the Mesopotamian creation myth. So that's originally Sumerian, but certainly Babylonian is the version we get, and that is a very interesting creation myth. For a number of reasons, but it basically says in the beginning there were primordial beings in a chaotic sea, two of them, and that's quite a common theme. Certainly the chaotic sea is so common, but then you get these two primordial beings, Apsu and Tiamat, and Apsu and Tiamat have babies, and the babies turn into gods or demons, and many of their names relate to water sources. So they relate to the delta and the estuaries of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers going into the Persian Sea or the Persian Gulf. And then these creatures fight each other, and some kill some and some don't kill some. Apsu's body, so Tiamat is a female and Apsu's the male. Apsu's killed quite early on, and his body is used to make almost like a world between the earth and the underworld where some gods live. And then some of the gods want to kill Tiamat, and basically they eventually choose a god, Marduk, and Marduk then is given some special weapons and whatever, and then kills Tiamat, cuts off her head, splits her body into two, and those two parts of her body becomes the earth and the firmament. And that's sort of crazy. Now, that is really interesting because you see hints of that myth in so many other places.
All right, so let's talk about. So let's go through the list of creation myths where there's the two primordial beings in the chaotic sea.
Yes. Okay. So the chaotic sea is I think, probably our first creation myth in human history. When we started thinking about creation, we thought of a sea, and then land grew from the sea. We didn't think of land and then sea came out of nowhere and covered it. And that's sort of logical if you think. So many myths have that. And in fact, at the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 1:1-2, talks about the sea, like the wind sweeps over the sea, and it calls it about the deep. And the word for deep in Hebrew is cognate with Tiamat. So the beginning of the Bible is basically telling you a synopsis of the Enuma Elish. So that's that's one ticked off your box. But then what we see is this myth go into Dune. So there's a village it's all in Mesopotamia. I think it's called Dune, Dunne, I think his actual name is. And in there, the myth changes slightly. So, but you have this patricide and matricide going on. So you basically get these two figures, and they have children, and the children then kill the dad, and then the mother sleeps with one of the sons and has another child who then kills the mother, and you get this, and it sort of creates in effect a reason why the gods that end up living are there. You know, it gives some, I don't know, purpose and some reasoning for that. So they didn't just come out of anywhere. There was some battles and whatever. And then, but what you find is that just before the final gods rule, the gods that rule tend to attack the gods, like their parents, and there are different things that happen. But we often see a situation where the god is castrated, and sometimes castrated with a sickle. So, and that makes sense because the sickle is a key part of agricultural farming. But the castration part's quite interesting, and that wounding, some perceive as being an evolution of the death of Tiamat, you know, the cutting off the head and slicing into two. There's this wounding to create that. And this myth from Dune, then we see in the Phoenicians, so that's sort of the Eastern Mediterranean and into Cyprus, and we see it go into the Hittite culture in Anatolia, and then we eventually see it in Greece. So what we find as Hesiod's Theogony has a similar thing where you have an earth mother and a sea, or Uranus, I think it is, and but before then there is Oceanus, which represents a personification of the sea, is in there as well. But you get all this matricide and patricide, and then eventually you get Zeus coming along and castrates Kronos, and then Zeus rules the world, and all sorts of things happen from Cronus's blood. So you see that, and that's really interesting. You get that link then from Mesopotamia all the way into Greece, and so they all touch. But then you get the Indo-Europeans, and the Indo-Europeans have a similar myth. So if I tell you the Nordic version rather than the reconstruction, and then we can go back to reconstruction, so it makes a bit more sense. But the Nordic version has in the beginning Ymir and a cow. And Ymir means twin. So there's like a double figure there. And the cow is because the cow is important, we believe, in Indo-European culture. And the cow licks ice and creates a god. Ymir rubs his legs together, in effect, and creates some Jotuns, which are like anti-gods, monstrous beings. And they get together and party, and more creatures are created, and more gods are created. And then what happens is that after 3 generations, Odin, Vili, and Ve appear, and Odin is the chief god, and he kills Ymir with his brothers, and Ymir floods the world with his blood, kills all but one set of Jotuns, and the world creates proper, world was created proper. So you get this flood myth in there, and that's interesting because I'll talk about that in a minute. But what we see is that then in other creation myths in the Indo-Europeans, all the way into India, the Purusa hymn of the Rig Veda, but also then some of the Yasts in Persia, and we actually see it in primitive myths in the Roman Empire. We get this Manu and Yima figure in creation. So Manu, man, Yimo, twin. So this twin persists, and the twin is always sacrificed, much like the two figures you see in that myth. And the twin is sacrificed, and the twin here often represents a king figure. And when they're sacrificed, their body is used to create the world. Their body is also used to create man, and then they end up ruling the underworld in what's left of them. But you find some differences in that way you go. So in the Purusa hymn, you'll find that the cow is then used to create some of the animals. But Manu is sacrificed. So sometimes Manu is sacrificed, more often like Yimo, but sometimes the cow. But you get this twin figure, this Yima, appears all the time in these Indo-European myths. So this is a representation of the twin. And then in Roman mythology, you have Romulus and Remus, which actually some work was done by Puvel in his book on comparative mythology, which is quite popular, which talks about how the etymology of those names actually were in effect Manu and Yimo, and how the myth originally was that Romulus was slain and cut up, much like Tiamat and Ymir, but the myth was eventually changed because Romans couldn't have their hero of Rome being killed at the end. They have to have something magic should happen with him, and so he turns into a sort of or something like a god type figure, but he goes off into the heavens, disappears. So you see this myth altogether. Now, what is interesting is if we look at other flavors of myths around that, we get Egyptian creation myths, and they start off with the chaotic sea. But actually, rather than have this sacrifice, what they tend to have is they have mud creating the world and then a god suddenly appearing. So there is a change happening between that Egyptian myth, like coming out of Africa, and what is happening in Mesopotamia. And what you actually see is Mesopotamian myth applied on top of Egyptian myth. So the Egyptian myth eventually changes, and you'll see the gods sort of think things into existence and like that. And that is coming from Mesopotamia. So again, where we talked about sources, this is where we've got to be careful. So if you said, John, what's the origin of the Egyptian mythology? I'd have to say, well, the part of it is absolutely fundamentally as primitive a creation myth as you can get, with the chaotic sea and mud appearing. But then part of it's had Mesopotamian mythology applied back onto it, and the Mesopotamian mythology has grown. And what's, again, interesting to me anyway, is that's this creation myth of this chaotic sea and the mud and that, which starts off as, so where the mud appears starts off as what we call an earth diver myth or motif, where in the beginning there was sea and a bird, normally a bird, and the bird dives to the bottom of the sea, picks up mud and brings it to the top of the sea, and the mud floats and creates land, which is the very earliest form of creation myth we can identify. Well, that actually, when it comes out of Africa, it travels into Asia and before coming back into the Near East. And we know that because we see this earth diver myth. But because much of China and Asia and Siberia isn't near sea, the myth changes and it stops being a creation myth and becomes a flood myth. So they talk about water deluging across the land rather than the land being created in the sea. And the earth diver that goes down to get mud to bring it up as land becomes a bird that flies off, looks for branches when the world is flooded, and comes back to bring branches to say, oh, there is land. And so what's ironic these days is that then flows back into the Near East, and then you get the Bible, which firstly stills the Mesopotamian creation myth as its opening lines of creation, but then throws in Noah's flood myth, which is the creation myth sort of redone from Asia back into it, and they put a dove in there which flies off to get branches to see that land is available and comes back to Noah. And so, as you said, that is the sort of the story of the creation myth, that we can see it come out of Africa, see it go to Asia and back again it evolved certainly in Mesopotamia, which is we then see in the Bible. It flows into Egypt, and then it combines with the Indo-European myth to create all these flavors of myths we've got today.
All right. Those are
That was
wow.
quite a brain dump there. But you see
Yeah.
these myths in North America too. So there are North American tribes that tell the Earth Diver myth.
Okay. So
So that's why we know
some of
Sold went to Asia.
some of these myths?
Sorry?
What are some of these Earth Diver myths?
So they're all very similar, but it basically is that there's a chaotic sea and there's a bird on the sea, but it can sometimes be a person or a creature, sometimes a beaver or an otter. And literally there's nothing in the beginning. So all these myths start in the beginning, there was nothing. So there wasn't even gods at this point. This isn't what the first thing they're thinking of. They're just thinking of an empty cosmos. And on the sea, the sea starts rippling or moving, and this creature appears and it dives down, gets the mud and comes back, and the land appears. And then we get different flavors of myth after that. So it's like the biggest one is a tree. So what happens is once the land's growing, we get a tree growing, and the tree pushes the sky up from the land to create heaven, so to speak. And then stars can appear, and that tree then we see appear in many myths, like you get the tree of life or the tree of knowledge or the pillars of heaven pushing up that tree, or you get mountains as well do this very similar thing in myth. And it's just an evolution of that tree motif. But yeah, so yes, there's all sorts there.
All right. Interesting. It's interesting to see that lineage across the globe of creation myths.
Exactly. What I would say is that it is, I mean, because there's so much information on it, we can clearly see that these have evolved and dispersed rather than being created individually. Because it just, there's too much coincidence from too many places for everybody to think exactly the same sort of thing everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we have confidence that the myth has traveled.
Yeah. Okay. Now, is there a cross lineage of creator gods or creator type deities that all of these are attributed to, or is it just looked at as here's the series of events that has happened and this is just the end result of it?
So that's sort of interesting. So you see this is where the Egyptian myth actually is quite interesting. So initially, different regions of Egypt had their own creation myth of earth forming or a muddy hill mound forming from the sea and the gods appear on it. But then I think it is in Memphis, the Memphite creation myth, where Ptah comes along and Ptah creates all the other gods, and then those gods do things. So, and that's quite interesting. So it's like you get a chief god, and in a way that looks like it's been done to help join religions and cultures together. And that is a very similar way to how the Mesopotamian myth works. They create create Marduk, who becomes the chief god who sort of aligns gods unto him, like El, and like an El is El or Elion is the gods that becomes the Abrahamic god eventually. So you see this chief god aspect come in, but that's about it. Before then, you just get gods that relate to particular elements of life, whether that be storms, whether that be fertility. Egyptian was a bit different. They did have some sort of material gods, like gods of infinity and gods of darkness, where we didn't quite get that in the Near East. They were more, let's say, to do with farming, and they're like, that's what we're seeing. So we see that, and we see a chief god come into play there, and that chief god, which seems to be male in the beginning, we sort of see it change into a female, or we certainly see a chief female deity pop up, where we get things like Kybele or what eventually turns into Inanna and Aphrodite, eventually in Greece. So we see that sort of appear, but that's very different to the Indo-European gods, which seem to be more male-centric, although there are female gods there. But so, yeah, there's no real commonality, what we find at that point of the myth is that it is the environment and the social experience that influences the pantheon's shape. So the creation of the world always happens in a very similar way, but the actual gods that then appear relate to your environment and what's going on. And that makes sense as well.
All right. It's fascinating. I think that's a good way also to conclude the interview.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No problem. Hope that was interesting. That was far deeper and more interesting than I thought. You know?